All right, hello, my name is Leah Smith, and my final project was predicting the future of home prices, a 20-year forecast for the US housing market. So my research question aims to understand the long-term factors influencing home prices to predict what home prices will look like in 20 years. My actual research question was, what economic, demographic, and policy factors will influence home price trends over the next 20 years? And my objective was to predict home price trends over the next 2 decades and to understand the influence of economic, demographic, and policy factors on our future home prices. Some key influences on home prices were economic factors, demographic trends, and policy factors. All these factors affect the housing market today and will continue to shape these trends that we'll see in the next 20 years. For economic factors, I have interest rate and mortgage availability, inflation rates, and general economic growth, alongside GDP growth and employment levels. For demographic trends, I have changing household formation, population growth, and migration patterns, and then aging populations and millennial homebuyers. And then lastly, for policy factors, I have housing policies, tax initiatives, and affordability initiatives, zoning laws, and building regulations. So the approach I used to predict future homes was I first started by extracting my data. I used speeches and expert opinions from the Federal Reserve, which I will talk more about that source in a minute. And then the second source I used the second step I took was identifying key economic indicators such as inflation, GDP growth, interest rate, housing supply, etc. Third step was developing assumptions. I assumed trends based on past data with a 3% annual growth in home prices. And then the fourth step was to simulate the 20-year forecast, home price trends based on economic growth rates, and then I put that all in a graph for a better visual. So again, my data source was the Federal Reserve speech. This speech was given by Vice Chair Philip Jefferson on May 20th, 2024, which I feel is quite important as this is a recent and reliable source to identify key economic and policy insights. His focus was economic outlook and its effect on the housing market, and this related to interest rates, inflation, and economic growth. Some examples sentences from the speech where interest rate will likely remain stable or rise slightly. Inflation targets around 2% per year, and then the housing market faces growing demand but limited supply, which I feel like are all very important factors when predicting what housing prices will look like within the next 20 years. So my forecast assumptions. So I assumed my growth rates just to predict based off of past data. So my interest rate growth was 2% annually, my inflation rate was 2% annually, and my economic growth was 2% annually. And lastly, my housing market growth was that 3% annually in housing prices. My simulated home pricing, my 20-year forecast. So my initial home price I started with was around 350,000, with that again annual housing growth of 3% a year. So based off of my conclusion, I saw that in 10 years, the average home price would be around 470,000, which is approximately a 35% increase from 2024. And then in that 20 years, the average home price should be around 635,000, with that annual increase of 81% from 2024, which is kind of crazy. One thing to mention is there's obviously different average home prices based on demographic area. Like for a major city, big cities such as New York or LA, et cetera, et cetera. Even my hometown, Detroit, I feel that 470 isn't really an accurate representation of what their average home price is, but I am taking in the large population of America, and that is what I got my average home price in. So again, the 635,000 that I calculated would be larger in those areas in 20 years that are overly populated or more popular. So this is my visual. Sorry, I don't know if you can see based off of this Zoom, but we'll still go. Home price visual. So I have this graph that I made, which starts around 2025 and ends just about 2044, starting at that 350 and then up to that 600,000. And as you can see, this graph is pretty linear. In the bottom left-hand corner, I put a graph that I found online of home prices over the past 20 years going up to 2023. And you can see that around 2012, we see this linear pattern that I predicted to continue all the way to 2024 or 2044. So we'll see if that happens. And then this is with that 3% annual growth rate. So word frequency in the speech. This is something I found very important when I was doing my data to look back at those varying factors. So some key terms from the speech, as I've mentioned before, were interest rate, where there was 1 mention, inflation, 25 mentions, housing market, where there was 2 mentions, GDP, which had 0 mentions, which I found kind of surprising, and then economic growth, 0 mentions, monetary policy had 17 mentions, and then interest rates had 3 mentions. This is the code I had used to find these values. I used an if statement, an else statement, and I used an URL to get that data. So inflation was the first most frequently mentioned term, which I mentioned was 25 times, suggesting that inflation pressures are expected to play a significant role in shaping future economic conditions and home pricing trends. And then monetary policy was also discussed extensively, which was those 17 times, highlighting its influence on interest rates, which in turn do affect home prices, which could explain why interest rate was only mentioned 3 times. Interest rates were mentioned 1 time in the context of future policy, emphasizing their importance in the overall economic outlook, but with a less focus compared to inflation and monetary policy, which now makes sense because all those terms can coincide to interest rates. Some key insights. Economic growth was moderate growth with 2%, will likely push home prices up, but affordability may be a concern. And then the housing market, driven by demand with limited supply, continuing to push up higher prices and policy impact. Government interventions like tax initiatives and affordability policies will play a significant role in this price growth. Some limitations and obstacles I faced when conducting this was data uncertainty. Economic conditions can change drastically in a blink of an eye, which can affect this growth assumption that I've made. And then more detailed models could include like regional variations, market cycles, policy shifts, demographic areas, etc. And then some short-term variability was like predicting the long-term trends based on short-term data can always produce uncertainty. Maybe if I went back, I would start my data before 2024 and continue off of there, just like that previous graph that I showed you. Some future work that I would do was integrate more sophisticated economic models to account for marketing cycles, and then account for varying home prices and trends across different US regions, I think would be very important. And then model different government policies and interventions, such as tax credit and new zoning laws. So my conclusion, home prices in 2044 are projected to be 81% higher than today, which I think is a very high number when you look at it. But if we're looking at past data compared to now, it is way significantly higher 20 years. And I think that's kind of something you expect as time goes on. But that 81% was really shocking to me. Key drivers were economic growth, demographic shifts, and limited housing supply, which could play a significant impact in the future if there is not enough land to support or to house all these people. That in turn would cause a dramatic shift in housing prices, which I just can't calculate because I don't know what that will look like. Policy influence government actions will play a crucial role in shaping future trends. So to conclude, the analysis and home price forecasting model suggests that under current assumptions, U.S. home prices will experience significant growth over the next 2 decades, with approximately an increase of 81% from 2024 to 2044, assuming that 3% annual growth. This insight can be valuable for various stakeholders, including homebuyers, investors, and policymakers. My results show that within the next 20 years, the average home price could be nearly around $635,000 for just an average home. That means that the average home price will be nearly doubled in the next 20 years due to average inflation, interest rate growth, and economy growth. So this is my works cited. I have on the very bottom, my speech is works cited, and then the top two are just two sites that I looked at to help advance my code and to find previous data. Thank you so much.